should shut down our topic for human trafficking. Yeah, if you think about it, really, one of the earliest industries to ever become globalized was the trade of human beings. No? When we hear the word slave, the thing that comes into mind are people from Africa being brought to the West, or people from India being tied down to their carpet weaving factories. But actually, studies right now indicate that our region, the ASEAN region, is one of the prime regions for human slaves in the modern world. Here in the Philippines alone, we have 60,000 to 100,000 victims every year. And given that our population isn't that big, for us to be number 3 in the world in human trafficking is actually quite disconcerting. And there are 2 causes that people tend to look at when they're looking at modern-day slavery, which is human trafficking. They tend to look at, number 1, the poverty incidence in that particular area and the difference that they have with the area that they're going to. And second, and more interestingly enough, they look at globalization as a phenomenon. Because they notice that the experts, at least in my field, notice that the more we become integrated and the more we become globalized, the more slaves we have. In fact, if you count the number of slaves in the world today, and you add all the slaves throughout the entire history of the human race, you have more slaves now than you have ever had in the history of the world. And this is a problem. But what is the face of that slavery? Because ordinary people, we don't really know what they encounter, right? So usually what I use for people to imagine it is, think of your own life and what you have, and think of everything you own taken away. Your freedom, all your gadgets, your devices, your clothes, your way of life, your family, and eventually your identity. Over time, people who have been enslaved either sexually or in forced labor tend to lose not only what they have, they tend to lose who they are. That's why we've had victims rescued who don't even remember their own names. We've had one girl rescued from Malaysia who basically couldn't even remember what her real name was. All she knew was the number they gave her, because that's what they get called, especially number 23. So this kind of exploitation is still happening, and that's the important thing we have to understand. It's not happening in hidden places. It's happening in plain sight. And where do they happen? They happen in the recruitment in our provinces, in the rural areas. So here in the Mekong region, in Myanmar, Vietnam, it's usually cross-border trafficking, where they move from the poorer regions into the richer regions, like the cities, or they move into Thailand. In the Mekong region, the trafficking tends to be more of sexual exploitation. In Indonesia, it tends to be more forced labor, meaning they're forced to work in factories, they're forced to work in homes, like forced domestic work. In the Philippines, well, we've got it all. We have both. It's more fun that way. We have both sex trafficking and we have forced labor trafficking. And it's not just trafficking that goes outside the country, it's a lot of trafficking that happens within the country as well. So from Cebu, or from even ARMM to Manila, from the poorer provinces to the richer provinces, from Tawi-Tawi to Davao, people are being brought from their families, from their communities, and put in another place for the purpose of exploitation. Why is there so much trafficking in Southeast Asia, you might ask? A lot of it has to do with the good things about the Southeast Asian culture. So for example, in the Filipino culture, when you are born into a family and you have 6 people in that family and your parents are farmers, there is an expectation on the part of young people to help the family, to take care of the family. And it is precisely this love and this love for family, this care for your siblings and your mother and your father that traffickers use as a weapon to manipulate people into exploitation. And that's really the situation that's prevalent all across Southeast Asia. Ironically, it is our love for family that turns us into modern-day slaves. So, what can we do as an ASEAN community? How many minutes now? Oh, 3 minutes pa lang. So, what can we do as a Southeast Asian region? Several things. The first problem that we've always had is that a lot of the international trafficking we can't do a lot about once they're already in the final destination. So case in point, very difficult to work with people trafficked into Sabah, Malaysia, for example. Very difficult to work for people that trafficked to Thailand or Indonesia. Why is that? Because while we are integrating as a region, we are not integrating enough in terms of practices for human rights. We are not integrated enough in terms of bilateral treaties that we could have with these member states, how to deal with the problem of human trafficking. In fact, one of our attaches of the Embassy of the Philippines was fighting for trafficking, was killed in Malaysia, precisely because he was fighting against an international gap. One thing you have to recognize is, this is a growing threat in our region and in the world. It is already the third largest illegal activity in the world, after the selling of guns and drugs. It's a $44 billion industry. What does that mean? You have international gangs, you have organized crime, you have people with weapons and guns threatening people like me and my family who work against this issue. Meaning, the only way that we will be able to effectively combat this problem as a region is if we are as organized as the criminals, is if we are as cooperative with each other as the organized criminals are, if we have like troops on the ground as they do. That's the problem that we have right now. We just don't have the political momentum in the region for that particular integration to take place. So while we're integrating in a lot of other things, we are not integrating in this fight. And the ironic part is all the countries in the Southeast Asian region have officially, in all their policies, declared slavery to be bad. I mean, no country in the right mind would say, okay, no, slavery, it's a good thing, right? So all of us, in principle, think it's bad. But somehow there are a lot of political stumbling blocks for this cooperation to take place. So on an official level, we need more bilateral or even multilateral cooperation on the issue. That's number one. Number two, we need to stop just rescuing people, and we need to actually prevent it on the ground. And here's where bloggers and young people will have a big role, right? Because a lot of the deception, a lot of the traffickers rely only on one thing. It's their capability to deceive people. It's their capability to manipulate people, to tweak the risk calculus for young people so that they're manipulated into joining this particular person to go to the city. But if young people talk about it enough, if people warn each other enough, if we are vigilant enough, then we can actually do something about it. That's why in our organization, we're working in schools. Now we have a campaign called the I-5 campaign. That's why I made a movie about human trafficking. Precisely because we want to penetrate young people's minds and make them aware of the risk that's taking place. Here's one important thing that you have to understand as well. Traffickers act like businessmen. And just like businessmen, they think of their profit margins and economies of scale. They're more efficient if they're transporting people en masse and on normal carriers like planes, ships, etc. Which means we actually see them in plain sight. We see them in the ports, we see them in the airports, we see them everywhere. And I'm sure most of you have had that experience where you go, why is this group of people with this guy? But you don't report, right? So the more people become vigilant and aware, the more difficult it is for these individuals to transact their illegal business. The more risky their investment becomes, the less likely they're going to go to this particular job. Baka iba na lang illegal activity going nila, mga drugs na lang. But the point that we're making is, it has to be a concerted effort on everyone who cares about the rights of people, who cares about the welfare of women and children, who cares about each other. Because it is an abomination that in a world that's supposedly so modern and so globalized, something so barbaric still exists, right? And that's